Before the memorable expedition of Lewis and Clark, none was found adventurous enough to penetrate that extensive portion of our continent, more than a few hundred miles. It was almost as little known to us as the interior of New Holland or the deserts of Africa. After the return of those celebrated travelers, several Indian traders were induced to extend the sphere of their enterprise, and one of them, Manuel Lisa, ascended the Missouri, almost to its source. These enterprising individuals, meeting with considerable success, a trading company or association followed, under the name of the Missouri Fur Company, formed in the hope of carrying on this business more extensively than it had hitherto been practiced, and, in time, of rivaling even the British associations in Canada. The company was composed of 12 persons, with a capital of about $40,000. A small sum, it is true, but as much as was necessary for a beginning. The company engaged about 250 men, Canadians and Americans. The first for the purpose of navigating the boats, but the latter as hunters, for it was their intention to hunt as well as trade. In the spring of 1808, they ascended the Missouri in barges, and left trading establishments in the Sioux country, also among the Arikaras and Mandans. After this, they proceeded with the main body to the three forks of the Missouri, about 3,000 miles from its source. The junction of the three rivers, Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin, are considered as forming the Missouri. The surrounding country, when compared with the bare plains of the Missouri, may be called woody, and from its situation, is well supplied with mountain streams. That ingenious and persecuted little animal, the beaver, is found here in great numbers, and this was the principal inducement for the company in establishing themselves here. But it is not in the power of those who adventure in untried paths to foresee all the obstacles which lie in the way. It is seldom the first adventurer who reaps the profits derived from opening a new road of enterprise. It is someone who follows him and takes warning from his misfortunes. The country about the sources of the Missouri forms a part of the tract wandered over by a nation of Indians called the Blackfoot, a ferocious savage race who have conceived the most deadly hatred to the Americans. This hatred is partly owing to an unfortunate rencontre between one of the natives and Captain Lewis. On that gentleman's return from the Columbia, in pursuing some of these Indians who had stolen some articles from his camp, he killed one of them by a shot from his rifle. Something may also be ascribed to the instigation of British traders, and perhaps to the jealousies of the Indians themselves, on seeing white hunters coming to establish themselves in their country, and to destroy the beaver. However this may be, it was not long after the establishment of the company and their building a fort, before the Blackfeet commenced hostilities. A hunting party of the whites, consisting of 10 or 12, whilst encamped on a small stream, were suddenly attacked, 4 of them killed, and the rest escaped with difficulty. It was now found necessary to go out on their hunting parties in considerable strength, which put them to great inconvenience, and rendered their success in hunting of little or no account. They were besides subject to frequent attacks, which harassed them exceedingly. Instead of 300 packs, upon which they might have calculated had they remained unmolested, they hardly procured 30 the first year, and the second none at all. The party was reduced to about 60 persons, by the detachments left at the different trading establishments below, and by persons sent off with such furs as had been collected. Add to this, about 20 had fallen in the different skirmishes with the Indians. Mr. Henry, one of the members of the company, who had the command of the party, finding his situation extremely precarious, crossed the Rocky Mountains and established himself on one of the branches of the Columbia, where he remained until the spring of 1811, the period at which I ascended the Missouri. In the meantime, the establishments at the Mandan and Arikara nations brought no profit, and at the Sioux establishment, after collecting buffalo robes and beaver fur to the amount of $15,000 or $20,000, the factory took fire, and the whole was burnt. It was now a prevailing opinion that the affairs of the company were completely ruined. Beside their losses, it was not known at this time what had become of Mr. Henry and his party, who had not been heard of for more than a year. In this state of things, it was resolved in the spring of 1811 to make one more effort, and if possible, retrieve their losses. It was moreover considered as a duty to carry relief to their distressed companions and bring them home. Manuel Lisa was chosen to undertake this arduous task. A man of a bold and daring character, with an energy and spirit of enterprise like that of Cortez or Pizarro. There is no one better acquainted with the Indian character and trade, and few are his equals in persevering, indefatigable industry. Possessed of an ardent mind and of a frame capable of sustaining every hardship, it would have been difficult for the company to have found a person better qualified for this enterprise. I believe there are few persons so completely master of the secret of doing much in a short space of time, which does not consist so much in any great exertion as in the strict observance of that economy which requires every moment to be turned to advantage. I feel a pleasure in bestowing this just praise on Mr. Lisa, whose kindness and friendship I experienced in so great a degree in the course of the voyage, and for the entertainment I have received at his hospitable board at St. Louis. Unfortunately, however, from what cause I know not, the majority of the members of the company have not the confidence in Mr. Lisa, which he so justly merits. But, on this occasion, he was entrusted with the sole direction of their affairs from necessity, as the most proper person to conduct an expedition which appeared so little short of desperate. The funds of the company were at so low an ebb that it was with some difficulty a barge of 20 tons could be fitted out with merchandise to the amount of a few $1,000s, and a patron procured. The members were unwilling to stake their private credit where prospects were so little flattering. This was also the last year appointed for the continuance of the association, and there was no certainty of its being renewed. With respect to myself, I must own to the reader that I had no other motive for undertaking a tour of several thousand miles, through regions but seldom marked even by the wandering footsteps of the savage, than what he will term an idle curiosity, and I must confess that I might have employed my time more beneficially to myself, and more usefully to the community. Would that I were able to make some amends by describing the many interesting objects which I witnessed in such a manner as to enable the reader to participate in the agreeable parts of my peregrinations. We set off from the village of St. Charles on Tuesday, the 12th of April, 1811, with delightful weather. The flood of March, which immediately succeeds the breaking up of the ice, had begun to subside, yet the water was still high. Our barge was the best that ever ascended this river, and manned with 20 stout oarsmen. Mr. Lisa, who had been a sea captain, took much pains in rigging his boat with a good mast, and main and topsail, these being great helps in the navigation of this river. Our equipage is chiefly composed of young men, though several have already made a voyage to the upper Missouri, of which they are exceedingly proud, and on that account claim a kind of precedence over the rest of the crew. We are in all 25 men, and completely prepared for defense. There is, besides, a swivel in the bow of the boat, which, in case of attack, would make a formidable appearance. We have also 2 brass blunderbusses in the cabin, one over my berth, and the other over that of Mr. Lisa. These precautions were absolutely necessary from the hostility of the Sioux bands, who, of late had committed several murders and robberies on the whites, and manifested such a disposition that it was believed impossible for us to pass through their country. The greater part of the merchandise, which consisted of strouting, blankets, lead, tobacco, knives, guns, beads, was concealed in a false cabin, ingeniously contrived for the purpose, in this way presenting as little as possible to tempt the savages. But we hoped that as this was not the season for the wandering tribes to come on the river, the autumn being the usual time, we might pass by unnoticed. Mr. Wilson P. Hunt had set off with a large party about 23 days before us, on his way to the Columbia. We anxiously hoped to overtake him before he entered the Sioux Nation. For this purpose it was resolved to strain every nerve, as upon it, in a great measure, depended the safety of our voyage. Having proceeded a few miles above St. Charles, we put to shore, some of our men still remaining at the village. It is exceedingly difficult to make a start on these voyages, from the reluctance of the men to terminate the frolic with their friends, which usually precedes their departure. They set into drinking and carousing, and it is impossible to collect them on board. Sometimes they make their carousals at the expense of the bourgeois. They are credited by the tavern keeper, who knows that their employer will be compelled to pay, to prevent the delay of the voyage. Many vexatious abuses are practiced in these cases. It was found impossible to proceed any farther this evening, the men in high glee from the liquor they had drank before starting. They were therefore permitted to take their swing. We had on board a Frenchman named Charbonneau, with his wife, an Indian woman of the Snake Nation, both of whom had accompanied Lewis and Clark to the Pacific, and were of great service. The woman, a good creature, of a mild and gentle disposition, greatly attached to the whites, whose manners and dress she tries to imitate, but she had become sickly and longed to revisit her native country. Her husband, also, who had spent many years among the Indians, had become weary of a civilized life. So true it is that the attachment to the savage state, or the state of nature, with which appellation it has commonly been dignified, is much stronger than to that of civilization, with all its comforts, its refinements, and its security. The next day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, having at length succeeded in getting all hands on board, we proceeded on our voyage. Found an excessive current, augmented by the state of the waters. Having come about 6 miles encamped. In the course of this evening, had as much cause to admire the dexterity of our Canadians and Creoles as I had before to condemn their frivolity. I believe an American could not be brought to support with patience the fatiguing labors and submission which these men endure. At this season, when the water is exceedingly cold, they leap in without a moment's hesitation. Their food consists of lide, or hulled, corn hominy for breakfast, a slice of fat pork and biscuit for dinner, and a pot of mush with a pound of tallow in it for supper. Yet this is better than the common fare. But we were about to make an extraordinary voyage, and the additional expense was not regarded. During the night we were completely drenched with the rain, the bark itself in a bad condition in the morning, weather somewhat cloudy clearing up. A short distance from our encampment, the hills approach the river northeast side. They are not high, but rocky, and do not continue more than a mile when the alluvion again commences. About 8, a fine breeze southeast sailed until 12 past. Several plantations southwest side. The bottoms are very extensive on the lower part of this river, the banks high, far above the reach of inundation. Timber, principally cottonwood. A few of the trees intermixed with it are beginning to vegetate. The red bud, the tree, which blooms earliest in our woods, and so much admired by those who descend the Ohio, early in the spring, appear in a few places. Past an island where the river widens considerably, the current rapid, obliged to abandon oars and poles, and take the towing line. Above the island, the bluffs again approach the river. There is a brownish-colored rock, with a few dwarf cedars growing on the top and in the clefts. In going too near the shore, we had the misfortune to have our topmast broken by the projecting limb of a tree, encamped some distance above. This evening one of the most serene and beautiful I ever beheld, and the calmness of the water in unison with the cloudless sky. Several deer, which I descried at a great distance, stepping through the shoals which separated the smooth sandbars, seemed to move across this stilly scene, like the shadows of the phantasmagoria, or Ossian's deer made of mist. I now felt that we had entered on our voyage in earnest. He that has not experienced something of these solitary voyages, far removed from the haunts of civilization, can scarcely imagine the heaviness which at the moment of departure weighs upon the heart. We all looked serious. I could see that some of our poor fellows heaved a sigh at the prospect before them, and at the recollection of the pleasant homes which they had left behind in the hopes of gaining a little money, perhaps to support a wife and children. A fire was kindled on the bank, the pot of mush and hominy were prepared, and after their frugal repast, wrapping themselves up in their buffalo robes and blankets, they soon forgot their woes in sleep. I observed on the sandbars a kind of scaffold, 10 or 15 feet in height, which I was informed was erected by the neighboring settlers for the purpose of shooting the deer by moonlight. These usually come out of the thickets at this time, to avoid the mosquitoes, and to sport on the smooth beach. The hunter ascends the scaffold, and remains until the deer approaches. Came this day about 20 miles, navigation comparatively easy. Friday 5th, wind southeast this morning, enabling us to set off under sail continued until 10, when it forsook us. Past several plantations and 2 islands. The bluffs disappear on the northeast side, and are seen on the southwest for the first time since our leaving St. Charles. They rise about 200 feet, and are faced with rock, in masses separated by soil and vegetation. These are called the Tavern Rocks, from the circumstance of a cave in one of them affording a stopping place for voyagers ascending, or on returning to their homes after a long absence. The Indians seem to have had some veneration for the spot, as it is tolerably well scratched over with their rude attempts at representing birds and beasts. From this place, through a long reach, or straight part of the river, we have a distant view of the terminating bluffs, northeast side. A violent storm of rain, wind, and thunder compelled us to put to shore, having passed a very dangerous and difficult place. The number of trees which had lately fallen into the river, and the danger to be apprehended from others, which seemed to have but a slender hold, rendered our situation extremely disagreeable. Towards evening, a canoe with 6 or 7 men passed on the other side, but we were unable to distinguish them. At this place I measured a cottonwood tree, which was 36 inches in circumference. They grow larger on the lower parts of this river than perhaps anywhere else in America. The bluffs, in the course of this day, appeared higher, but not so abrupt or rocky. Saturday, 6th. Having passed a small willow island, we found ourselves beyond the hills on the southwest side. At 11 o'clock, the wind became so high that we were compelled to stop, as it blew directly down the river. This is Boone's settlement, about 60 miles from St. Charles. A number of plantations at the edge of the bottom. The wind abated in the evening. We proceeded a few miles further and encamped. Sunday 7th. Water rising. Crossed to the southwest side and encountered a very swift current at the head of a willow island. The difficulty of this navigation is not easily described. Made Point Labadie, so called from a French trader who formerly wintered here. 40 years ago, this was thought a distant point on the Missouri. At present, there are tolerable plantations everywhere through the bottom. The carcasses of several drowned buffaloes passed by us. It is said that an unusual number of them have been drowned this year. Some have been seen floating on the river at St. Louis. Upwards of 40 were counted on the head of an island by a gentleman who lately descended the river from Fort Osage. In the spring of the year, great numbers of these animals perish in attempting to pass the river on the ice, which at this season is easily broken. Immediately below the Point Labadie, the river contracts its breadth and is confined to a channel of 300 or 400 yards wide, passed between an island and the main shore. A very narrow channel, but the current and distance less. A channel of this sort is often taken in preference, but there is sometimes danger of the upper end being closed with logs and billets of wood matted together, as it turned out in the present instance. Fortunately for us, after the labor of an hour we were able to remove the obstacles, else we should have been compelled to return. Opposite the head of the island there is a tolerable log house, and some land cleared. The tenant, a newcomer, with a wife and 6 children, had nothing to give or sell. Here the banks fall in very much, the river more than a mile wide. A great impediment in opening lands on this river is the dilapidation of the banks, which immediately ensue when the trees are cut away, from the current acting upon a soil of a texture so extremely loose. It will be found absolutely necessary to leave the trees standing on the borders of the river. The river exceedingly crooked in the course of this day. A number of plantations on both sides. These usually consist of a few acres cleared, on the borders of the river, with a small log hut or cabin, and stables for horses. C. They raise a little Indian corn, pumpkins, potatoes, and a few vegetables. But they have abundance of hogs and horned cattle. Having made about 14 miles, we put to shore, after passing a very difficult embarras. This word requires some explanation. Independently of the current of that vast volume of water rolling with great impetuosity, the navigation is obstructed by various other impediments. At the distance of every mile or two, and frequently at smaller intervals, there are embarras, or rafts, formed by the collection of trees closely matted, and extending from 20 to 30 yards. The current, vexed by these interruptions, rushes round them with great violence and force. We may now judge what a boat encounters in grappling round these rafts. When the oars and grappling hooks were found insufficient, the towing line was usually resorted to with success. There is not only difficulty here, but considerable danger, in case the boat should swing round. In bends where the banks fall in, as in the Mississippi, trees lie for some distance out in the river. In doubling points, in passing sawyers, difficulties are encountered. The water is generally too deep to admit of poling. It would be absolutely impossible to stem the current further out than a few yards. The boat usually passes about this distance from the bank. Where the bank has not been washed steep, which is most usually the case, and the ground newly formed, the young tree of the willow, cottonwood, which overhang the stream, afford much assistance in pulling the boat along with the hands. Monday 8th. The water fell last night, as much as it had risen. About 10, came in sight of a little village northeast side called Charette. There are about 30 families here, who hunt and raise a little corn. A very long island lies in the bend in which this village is situated. About this island, passed under a gentle breeze. Some very handsome bluffs, southwest side to the Isle aux Buffs. They are about 100 feet high, and excepting a few places where rocks appear, covered with oak and other timber. At this place the river makes a considerable bend. Instead of taking the main channel, we entered a small one between the island and the shore, which will shorten the distance, the current not so strong. The channel is about 50 yards wide, and very handsome, having clean even banks, and resembling a small river. It is about 4 miles in length. Through all these islands, and on the Missouri bottoms, there are great quantities of rushes, commonly called scrub grass. They grow 4 or 5 feet high, and so close as to render it very disagreeable, as well as difficult, to pass through the woods. The cattle feed upon them in the winter, answering the same purpose as the cane on the Mississippi. At the upper end of the Isle aux Buffs, we were compelled about 5 o'clock in the evening to put to shore, on account of a violent storm, which continued until after dark. In the badly constructed cabin of our boat, we were wet to the skin. The men were better off in their tents, made by a blanket stretched over twigs. We have been accompanied for these 2 days past by a man and 2 lads, ascending in a canoe. This evening they encamped close by us, placing the canoe under cover of our boat, unsheltered, except by the trees on the bank, and a ragged quilt drawn over a couple of forks. They abode the pelting of the pitiless storm with apparent indifference. These people are well dressed in handsome homemade cotton cloth. The man seemed to possess no small share of pride and self-importance, which, as I afterwards discovered, arose from his being a captain of militia. He borrowed a kettle from us, and gave it to one of his boys. When we were about to sit down to supper, he retired, but returned when it was over. When asked why he had not stayed to do us the honor of supping with us, "I thank you, gentlemen," said he, licking his lips with satisfaction. "I have just been eating an excellent supper." He had scarcely spoken when the patron came to inform Mr. Lisa. The boys were begging him for a biscuit, as they had eaten nothing for 2 days. Our visitant was somewhat disconcerted, but passed it off with, "Poh, I'm sure they can't be suffering." He resides on the Gasconade. His was the second family which settled in that quarter about 3 years ago. He has at present about 250 men on his muster roll. We were entertained by him with a long story of his having pursued some Potawatomis, who had committed robberies on the settlements some time last summer. He made a narrow escape, the Indians having attacked his party in the night time, and killed 4 of his men after a desperate resistance. The captain had on board a barrel of whiskey to set up tavern with, a bag of cotton for his wife to spin, and a couple of kittens for the purpose of augmenting his family. These kept up such doleful serenades during the night that I was scarcely able to close my eyes.